Welcome to our discussion this week of active and passive audiences. We'll be discussing the sides of the triangle having to do with the object and the audience. If you'll recall, our three major theories, functionalism, social conflict, and postmodernism, each makes assumptions about society. Functionalists assume that all the parts of society, including the media, work together to make a coherent whole. The social conflict theorists assume that all the parts of society, including the media, work together to maintain power in the hands of those who already have it. And the postmodernists assume that all the parts of society, including the media, are contested in terms of meaning and interpretation. In each of these major traditions, there are common assumptions about the impact of the cultural product on the consumer, which is what we'll be discussing today. While we'll be talking about specific theories, you might find it useful to connect those theories to the three larger traditions. Our first theory is the direct effects theory, which really is based on social learning theory. Social learning theory argued that learning is cognitive. That is to say, we not only learn how to do things, but we also learn why they should be done and what the benefits and consequences of doing them are. This is true for many aspects of life, where we learn from watching our socializing agents like peers, family, teachers, and community leaders, what kinds of behaviors are rewarded and which are punished, and we learn a justification for why we should do some of those behaviors and avoid others. Bandura argued that the media can act as a socializing agent that models certain values for its viewers. If we look at Blue Bloods, for example, the show puts a high emphasis on family and sacrifice for the common good. But it also emphasizes government and law and order. The social learning theorist would argue that this kind of messaging presents viewers with a model and a justification for rule-abiding behavior as a universal good, and that it acts as a socializing agent for that purpose. The limited effects model is a bit more of a negotiated understanding of the complexity of the process. It suggests a two-step process by which media influences society. The first step is that the news is broadcast or the television shows are aired and watched by a portion of the public. According to the Pew Research Center, about 65% of Americans watch news and 35% watch cable news. On average, they spend about 12 and a half minutes watching the news. The limited effects theorists argue that there's a portion of society, the opinion makers, who spread the information they learn to friends and family. These opinion makers have a strong tendency to find news that confirms their long-held beliefs, and then they pass it along as authority to friends and family. In this sense, the news is very much not propaganda, but rather an agent for use by the opinion makers who are experiencing confirmation bias. Confirmation bias suggests that humans unintentionally give more credence to information that agrees with their pre-existing views and less attention to information that sheds doubt. For example, a Pew study of partisan news viewing found that 60% of Fox News viewers describe themselves as conservative, and that number climbs when exploring particular shows. On the other end, 57% of Rachel Maddow viewers consider themselves to be liberal, and 30% of MSNBC viewers consider themselves to be liberal. This two-step model argues that those viewers consume information that supports their worldviews and they spread it as gospel to friends and family. The next models we're going to talk about suggest that people use and remix media for their own purposes. It argues that while the media may have an intended message, it does not preclude people from taking their own interpretation of the work. The uses model argues that people use media for their own needs and purposes, including distraction, personal relationships, and identity work. The Common Sense Project surveyed teenagers and pre-teenagers, and they found that this group of Americans spend on average 9 hours a day consuming some form of social media, or media in general. This includes social media, the internet, music, television, all kinds of screens. This level of connectivity to the screens is a distraction from the boring tasks or the everyday struggles of childhood and teenage life. Now listen, although adults tend to bemoan that their teenagers are always glued to a screen, the case is that adults actually consume more media by more than an hour per day than teens and preteens. This is due to the availability of screens for adults, phones, social media, and also on-demand video services like Netflix. The media may also be used for personal relationships. We call these parasocial relationships, where viewers or consumers create a connection to the community, and they develop an investment in characters or trusted relationships with their news source. We identify parasocial relationships when people are interacting with their characters but not necessarily identifying with them. So this isn't hyper-reality, and it's not just for crazies. But people tend to connect with the characters in books or feel a personal connection with their news reporters in a way that suggests or replaces everyday interactions with human beings who you can see and touch and talk to. The last kind of interpretation or use is one where we use the media as a form of identity. Tia Denora wrote a wonderful book called Music in Everyday Life, where she talked about people using music as a way of managing their identity. They can use music or really any form of media to tell the world information about themselves, like what kind of person they are, assumptions we make about country music listeners versus gospel music listeners. They might also use the music to manage their own emotions, to help them get over being angry, or to remember what it was like to fall in love that first time. Lastly, Denora found that people used music to remember their own story. That is, when you're having a tough time or when you're trying to manage your own emotions, you might remember a time when you were happier and use music or media to take you back to that happy place. The last approach to media use has to deal with encoding and decoding messages. Viewers can assume that there is a dominant, negotiated, or oppositional viewing to every piece of media they consume. If you take Blue Bloods, for example, the dominant reading might really value the sacrifice and commitment that the Reagan family gives to the public good. And they might see that family as always being faultless or making the right choice. A negotiated viewing might think that there are some good things happening, but also some questionable issues of police brutality that ought to be addressed. An oppositional reading of the show might look at some of the problematic aspects in terms of the way that the law enforcement manipulates citizens, or even the way that women and non-whites are portrayed in the movie in a stereotypical way. In all of these theories, the relationship between the cultural object and the receiver is balanced based on a worldview that imagines an active or a passive receiver. I hope this little lecture has helped you to understand Section 4. Next week will be our final lecture as we move into the research phase of your class. As always, please let me know if you have questions or if I can be helpful in any way.